Hey fellow fraud fighters, I'm Jimmy Fong, CCO at SEON, and welcome to the Cat Mouse podcast. SEON is fortunate to work with businesses such as the likes of Revolut, Nubank and Patreon in the fight against fraud. But with this podcast, we want to provide a comfortable space for people to talk about the daily challenges, topics on the horizon, and ultimately give us all a better insight into the mindset of fraudsters. And with that, on with the show. So I'm very excited to share we've got Claire Maillet, the head of financial crime over at Jaja Finance, joining us for this Cat and Mouse podcast. Claire, big welcome to you. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
So let's kind of start with that then. So you head up fin crime for Jaja Finance. For the audience out there, maybe a sentence on what Jaja Finance does, who you help with today.
Yeah, sure. So, Jaja Finance is a credit card company. We're probably most well known at the moment for having migrated over the Bank of Ireland customers back in October 2020. And yeah, we're hoping to launch our own product very, very soon.
Super cool. Nice. And in our pre-chat, what we particularly love from your background as a fraud fighter was actually the amazing kind of academic background you had leading up to kind of your current adventure, right? Maybe we can jump back into some of that. So my understanding is you mastered in counter fraud and counter corruption studies. So that's how your academia started. I'll be really curious just to hear, what was that experience like? How did that arm you with kind of your mindset?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that seems like a long time ago now. And it was actually. It was back in 2016. I undertook a part-time master's with the University of Portsmouth, basically looking at how corruption and fraud taint the world as we know it, really. The modules itself could range from anything from international fraud and corruption to economic crime within sport, within human trafficking, exploitation, that sort of thing. So it was very, very vast. For my thesis, in the end, I chose on looking at the value of data sharing internationally for the purposes of fraud detection and prevention. And I think that sort of put me in a good stead to understand not only how economic crime works within the UK, but also on a wider scale as well.
Yeah, amazing. And very pertinent indeed to kind of your day-to-day expertise on how you help organizations. Even before that, like I was curious to, in that thesis originally that you pulled out for your master's, what were you seeing as roadblocks to things like information being shared within an organization that would help, of course, the kind of international financial crime kind of combating?
So obviously there's going to be the standardization issues. You know, lots of countries have economic crime data. However, it's not measured in the same way, it's not captured in the same way. And there will often be bits of data that certain countries or certain groups capture that others don't. And so it's very difficult to sort of find the links between all of them if you have different data being collected by different organizations, different groups. And the lack of standardization between those makes it very difficult to create a unified approach to tackling economic crime. Obviously, there are groups such as Europol and others along those lines who work on an international global basis. However, that from a government's perspective will also impact how economic crime is dealt with from one country to another as well.
That makes total sense there. And I can only imagine that the complexity in trying to have any form of standardization, gosh, that just sounds like a almost insurmountable challenge in order to. How nitty gritty did you get into some options that might be considered to try and solve that? like, I guess that's been something that's been, a decades long kind of challenge there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you can obviously put in all of the steps that you think would be necessary, but unless you get the approval and the get-go and proactive attitude from everyone else, it isn't just one person saying, I want to do this and this is how I'm going to go about doing it. You need the buy-in from everyone else as well. And I think especially within financial services, there's a real siloed approach to tackling economic crime because they don't want to let other competitors know what they're doing, and they want to be seen as the best company among all of their competitors. And so I think there's that danger of, let alone businesses sticking and to a siloed approach. If we think about that on a wider scale, if we have countries doing the same, then obviously fraud and other economic crime isn't going to stay within one country. It's going to cross borders. And so I think we need to get out of the habit of thinking that a siloed approach is the best way to work.
Yeah, that's a very recurring theme we get on this show, with this move away from kind of siloed, and oftentimes it is cited, Claire, that there's certain incentives if you're a private business where there's competition, there's winning market, as you mentioned, and there's also the intellectual property advantage of the data that's coming through. So it's not always in the interest of literally the financial survival of that business beating competitors to kind of break down the silos and share as freely as possible. And that's really cool, because that masters that you conducted was done at a time where I think during the day you were working at one of kind of the most well-known global online retailers at that stage in your day job, as literally in fraud investigations for that online retailer. And then you moved on to, I think, SciFast, which I think represents a lot of kind of the philosophy of trying to break down the barriers of information share, right? And to give useful information to all organizations part of that network there. So Absolutely. It's interesting to have a mix of academia and your day role of fighting crime from an operational level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, I always knew that it would be brilliant, obviously, to get the professional expertise in my field, but to be able to back that up with the academic knowledge as well, it just adds an extra layer. And personally, and it really allows me to think things through from and different perspectives as well. And yeah, I just see it as a way of me being able to learn more and to understand more about this field that I love so much, and to be able to understand other people's views and to see where research has changed and developed over time as well. It's all really, really useful.
And I was going to say, with your current, so you're now embarking on, or for the last couple of years, I think, on conducting your PhD as an extension of the University of Portsmouth, if I understand correctly. And it's into the criminal justice studies there. And I think that's scheduled. You're still in the process, right?
I'm a third of the way through, and it's a part-time PhD, so it takes 6 years in total. So I'm a third of the way through, and that's looking at the role of insider fraudsters within business. So I've sort of left the corruption bit to one side, and I've just really wanted to focus on the internal fraud stuff. I just find it so interesting. And I think particularly during COVID times, it's a fraud ideology that's becoming more and more spoken about. So the fact that I've sort of started doing this and during COVID has been actually very, very well timed. but it's something that I find very, very interesting. And to me, it sort of opens up a new way of thinking, because you're not just thinking about people perpetrating fraud against a business or a person where there's that separation there. You're doing it against your own employer. And that sort of creates a link between you and the people that hired you, basically, and they and pay your wages. And I think it just takes a whole different type of person to sort of have the guts to do that in a way. And so for me, I just thought that it'll be an a topic that's just too interesting to not research, basically.
Amazing. We had our last guest, Raphael, who heads up fraud for a very large online gambling company, and he was sharing. He used to run his own taxi business in Latin America, and what he was saying was that one of his own taxi drivers, he experienced fraud, very much that firsthand, where one of his employees, his own taxi drivers, defrauded him. And he was it sounded like the most ridiculous of like tales, where he had found it out when the taxi driver had literally given customers a 1-digit difference bank account number to pay into. And so it was it opened up that he was sophisticated enough to get the bank's help with creating a new bank account that was almost the same as his, but just one digit different. But then secondly, it was coming from that one taxi driver, so it would have been like tracked back eventually. So it wasn't very sophisticated. Yeah. It opens up all sorts of questions of psychology around, well, they knew they must have been caught eventually, so they're willing to burn relationships for, and in that world, like relatively small sums, even relative to kind of local like lifestyle. So yeah, just like all sorts of like questions around motive, around opportunism, around kind of what the heck was going on in the head there. So in your thesis, I'm curious, any kind of topical things that you're finding particularly fascinating that you're pulling out from that doctorate that you might share? Like, I'm curious to that.
Yeah, so at the moment, I'm currently looking at sort of what a company can do to stop economic crime. So we're looking at the codes of and conduct the company can have in place, and policies and processes to help businesses stop insider fraud, but also looking at the morality and the ethics of the staff themselves. Because if you look at the interview process, for example, you essentially need to establish within an hour or two of just talking to someone, are they going to be able to do the job that you want them to do? B, are they going to add value to your business? And C, are they actually going to try to defraud you? And basically, and I think just through having a quick chat with them, it's very difficult to gauge where their morals lie. And that's something that you actually can't really measure in itself, because what could be moral to me might not be moral to you, and also vice versa. And so you're sort of looking at a gauge, like a really wide scale of how do you measure that behavior against what the company expects you to do. So at the moment, I'm looking into a few different bits that will need to be narrowed down, but it's quite difficult at the start because you've got so many different parts of one topic that you're so interested in, and you're being told to narrow it down, and you're like, I don't want to, it's too interesting. So yeah, it's definitely getting somewhere, but I'm still fairly early on in the process.
Yeah, fascinating. And when you talk about that example, I think of, gosh, how big does that scale have to be? You think of control as well. There's so many factors. Like, it's subjective as anything, really, which is
absolutely.
And you're right. Even we constantly, as a startup ourselves, we constantly are looking at, in that multiple kind of interview process, people are, of course, their best self. It's literally the dynamic of a situation. And all we're trying to do in that stage is, will they be amazing at that particular roles and responsibilities? That's fairly defined, but let alone when you're trying to look at it, how can you, other than say moral, kind of expectations as you'd expect, is a whole new factor. We're not even for us, we're not even necessarily thinking of that. So that's really interesting to kind of consider that. I wanted also to kind of take our chat to another area in terms of, I think, your practical experience as you've kind of worked in the fraud and risk kind of world. I'd love to kind of hear how you view, Claire, kind of two major concepts around onboarding new customers. You've had a lot of pragmatic experience in this, and having teams to kind of look after this. How do you view kind of using technology for onboarding new customers, whether it's used externally or as a tech company or a financial technology company building in-house? How do you kind of view that equation?
I mean, I think that there are pros and cons to both, which is probably a very dull and diplomatic answer that you weren't after necessarily. But I think with the people who sell these and technologies, they are the experts, and that's what they do. That's their product. That's their livelihood. And so you can really tell when someone is selling a product that they truly believe in, and that's key, I think, in how you present a product to a potential customer, because you can easily tell the difference between someone who sells the product because they want commission and those who sell the product because they think it's genuinely a really, really good product. And so by being able to use that, I think is also very, very interesting as well from that perspective. But I think in-house is also really, really beneficial, because you know the company, you know how it works, you know how it functions. And if you come from an external perspective, you have the complications of thinking, how is this tech going to fit into our company, to our processes, our journey? Whereas if you have it built in-house, then you already know that. You've already got those obstacles out of the way, as it were. And so, yeah, there are definitely pros and cons to both. And I think it can work both ways. I've seen it in and different companies work both ways, but obviously both come with their own challenges. But I've seen it work. Yeah,
that makes sense. I think that's a totally fair response. So no need for the kind of precursor of this is kind of the balanced argument. I think that's solid rationale there. Also curious with I guess age-old consideration of how do you balance having an amazing, especially in fintech, right? Amazing UX, like almost magical onboarding experience versus, say, security and onboarding the right type of customer. How do you kind of view that equation?
I mean, that's an old age question, isn't it? I've worked in risk teams in the fraud space where the focus has purely been on, we don't really care about the customer, we just want to keep the bad guys out. And I've also worked in the operations space where it's, yes, we want to keep the bad guys out, but we really love the customer and we need to keep them happy. So I've seen it from both perspectives. And it is a balance that is definitely difficult. But from my experience, what I've sort of come to try to portray is, if you increase the security, you may make customers less happy than a smooth onboarding journey. However, I'd like to think that, especially in this day and age where everything's gone a bit techy, it's gone digital, that actually I would like to think personally that the customer would understand that the business is doing what it can to protect the customer. And I don't know if this is just because of my background, but if I had to go through more stages to sign up to a business, I would be more inclined to think, well, actually, is the business doing this to help me? And I would almost feel safer in that respect. I know that there are people out there who will think, no, it has to be smooth, it has to be
That's
easy,
definitely your
it has to be done
background.
in like 10 seconds. But for me personally, I would like to think that actually, if there are say maybe one or two extra steps, then actually that would make me trust the company more, because I don't see the point in trying to implement tech for the sake of. If it serves a purpose, then I don't see why it shouldn't be done. And so I think, yeah, if you're able to justify why you're adding more security steps in there, then I think the customers would hopefully be grateful in return, because ultimately you're doing what you can to protect them and their money as well.
Just before our chat, Claire, we were on a Zoom with a co-founder of a large payroll fintech. And they were very upfront with, gosh, by removing some of those onboarding steps, I think we would almost create the reverse image that, hey, this is a bit sketchy. Why is it so easy to sign up to this service where we're going to like front load employees' wages into their bank account, and they're not even asking me for my selfie, etc. So it's a totally valid argument that maybe removing all friction isn't always applicable in every circumstance when onboarding. Like you said, it can give a bit of confidence as well. There's always balance, I'm sure, to that. And I wanted also to kind of get your point of view, Claire, on one of the big advocates I know you have on a personal and also on a professional stance is kind of the subject around mental health within the kind of workspace as well. I'd love to hear kind of maybe your own personal kind of experience, but then also kind of where you've seen that advocacy work really well and effectively within kind of your working life there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've always been very open about my mental health problems. I've had them for well over a decade now, and so I've kind of grown into the space where I am open to having those conversations. And as a mental health first aider, I am absolutely more than happy to have those conversations as well. And I think that in return, you sort of become aware of how do you then apply what you're experiencing to customers who are vulnerable. And I think it does open up that kind of new sort of space that people might often overlook, because if you can't put yourself in their shoes, then it's so much more difficult to understand how you can, as a company, how you can help those customers. And so definitely from that perspective, that has really, really helped me from an operations financial crime standpoint, but also just from a view of being able to assist the company culture. For me, being able to openly talk about my mental illnesses, I think really, really helps to get your colleagues to understand that they aren't the only person who probably feels the way that they're feeling. And it just starts the conversations. It helps to break down the stigma. And I think anything that anyone can do to help normalize those discussions, I think it's definitely all for the better.
Yeah, and I think COVID obviously brought a lot of kind of spotlight to obviously quite strained working kind of environments, of course, right? Normality was kind of broken and is broken. And I think that added strain just puts even more of a spotlight on how to help, us as teammates, friends, humans in that situation. Is there any kind of, from your point of view, any kind of practical kind of, I guess, advice you might share with other risk teams out there where, and I think the risk teams are always the perfect example of the incentives are so hard for fraud fighters. On one hand, their role is to safeguard good business, but on the other hand, the private businesses need to grow. So there's a massive conflict there, it just intrinsically. I'm curious to any kind of tips to other, managers of fraud fighters in terms of how to support in the initiative you just mentioned.
I think it should be key for all businesses to have mental health first aiders. I think that sort of goes without saying. It's really, really beneficial. And I think it should be mandatory, really, for all businesses to have mental health first aiders, especially given, in the sort of and COVID world or post-COVID world that we live in. I think it's become all the more important now. And I think that mental health is sort of finally starting to get the voice that it needed. From a sort of risk team perspective, I think it should just be something that people are willing to talk about. I just think if you say that you're open to have those discussions as both a mental health first aider and a people manager as well, I've always said to my team, I'm more than open to have these and discussions with you, and I shall take off my manager hat and put on my mental health hat, because sometimes you don't want to talk to your boss about it, but you want to talk to someone else. And I think if I'm able to offer my team both of those, then I think that puts me in a good position to ultimately keep my team happy and to look after them from both a professional and a and personal viewpoint as well. So
that makes total sense. For me, my takeaways from this is one is I think empathy and understanding is kind of critical, and given kind of added stress of in the last 2 years. And I think any thriving company that's clearly what's at top of mind is to help your fellow humans kind of be successful in what they're doing. So thank you for sharing that. Claire, this has been a fascinating chat. I really appreciate the kind of topics we dived into. As you may know, our show is the Cat and Mouse podcast, and we always try and ask our guests, in the world of professional fraud fighter like yourself versus the adversary, the professional fraudster, who do you think represents the cat and who represents the mouse in that scenario, and why, Claire?
I would say that the fraudsters are the mice, because they're always one step ahead, aren't they? As much as I hate to say it, they always are one step ahead. But I think we are always going to be chasing them. We're always going to be one step behind potentially, because by the time we've worked out how to tackle one type of fraud, they've already worked out how to do the next lot of fraud, haven't they? So we are always going to be chasing, I believe. I think you can have the best tech, the best people in the world working for you in your aim to fight fraud, but they'll always find new ways. Even before we can think of, how is this piece of tech or this legislation going to be exploited, they'll have already worked that out, I think. But I don't necessarily think it's always mice we're chasing. I think because obviously fraud comes in so many different forms. So we don't always know what we're looking for until it hits. And so, yes, you could say that we're the cats and we're chasing mice, but actually we're also chasing unknowns to an extent, because we can we can hazard a guess as to what sort of frauds are going to be out there based on what we already know, but we don't know what we don't know, right? So I think, yeah, they'll always be nice to catch, but we're also chasing the unknown as well.
No, that's awesome. Thank you again so much for coming on. Really.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.